Well, hello and happy Sunday. Good morning. Welcome to Sunday Coffee with Dr. Childress. The Today I'm going to be discussing the terrorist mind. We are uh, in the midst of an emerging situation in Israel and Gaza that is deeply disturbing. Um, and then we've just endured, or at least Maine has just endured, a shooter who inflicted tremendous grief and loss in their communities. And it would seem as though those are two different types of situations. We have Hamas as an organized attack against Israel, and it was all planned out. And it's within the context of like a war situation over there. And then we have an individual shooter who, for no apparent reason, some sort of personal grievance, goes into a bar in a bowling alley and shoots people up. And those would seem to be two different motivations, two different types of pathology. And it is my position that they're not, that they are variants of the same pathology, which is pathological hatred and pathological violence. And it just takes different forms in that. And one of the things I want to point out, just beginning, is that we don't have any diagnoses within the DSM structure for pathological anger and hatred and violence, such as racist violence, racist mindset. That's Racism is not on a spectrum of normal. No, it's no, it's a deviant thinking pattern. That level of extremist racism or anti-Semitism, um, or the violence that takes place in the violence of Ukraine. Uh, Dropping bombs on Ukraine is the same as you know, dropping, or shooting up a bar or Hamas. It's still the same sort of savagery that puts us over the edge. That's not normal. We have diagnoses for all the other mood disorders or emotional disorders. So pathological sadness, that's depression. And so we have diagnoses for depression. Pathological anger, pathological anxiety or pathological fear, that's your panic attacks and your various anxiety disorders. We even have a disorder for pathological happiness, that's mania. But we have nothing for pathological anger, the hatred and the pathological violence that is created by that. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that we normalize it. We think it's normal and we call it war. There's no such thing as war. That's a euphemism. It is savagery. It is it's pathological violence. And the fact that we've been doing it for centuries and centuries does not make it normal. It's still severely pathological, but we think it's normal. And so war is okay. And if we condone pathological violence under the concept of war, and now we've defined these things called war crimes. This is the first time in history we've had war crimes. We didn't have that in the 1800s or 1700s. We're going all the way back. There's no such thing as war crimes relative to Genghis Khan. But recently, we've developed this idea of war crimes as we are becoming healthier and we're recognizing the pathology that's involved. But all war is a crime. To drop bombs on Dresden or drop bombs on Gaza or, in any context, Ukraine, that's just insane. That's just pathological violence. It's savagery and it's slaughter. So as long as we normalize pathological anger, pathological hatred, and violence, we won't be able to recognize the pathogen that's underneath all of the various manifestations or variants. So today I'm going to be discussing bringing that all together and proposing that there's a single pathogen that's causing all these different variants. And one of the implications is this the same pathology, it's the same pathogen as in the family courts. Narcissistic, borderline, dark, psychopathic, sadistic. Um, and it's just a different variant of that pathogen. And that's how I got into the terrorist mind, is as I worked out the pathology in the family courts, it's just linked over. And I said, oh my goodness. And so I started to keep a blog on the terrorist mind to begin to engage the dialogue and expose the connections. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. So the terrorist mind is there's three aspects to it. There's an empathic failure, there's a moral distortion, and there's sadism. Um, and I think of this pathology or the pathogen that's in our attachment networks, and it's damaged information structures in our attachment networks. And they're a set, and it's a constellated set, coherent set of damaged information structures, which then creates a pattern of symptoms. And so it's this damaged set of information structures that I call the pathogen. And I tend to think of it like a molecular structure. And so I'm sharing kind of my visual on it. I chose the caffeine model, the caffeine molecule as my example of it, because I kind of like caffeine. Oh my goodness, Sunday morning coffee. So it's one of my favorite molecules. And so here's the structure of the caffeine molecule, like those little balls and sticks we put together in chemistry class. And from my perspective, this is kind of how I see it. Is there's different core structures to that. So what ends in this diagram would be narcissistic structures, narcissistic information structures, idea structures, meaning structures. But it's a coherent idea. So for narcissists, we have absence of empathy, we have grandiosity, we have entitlement, various aspects that we identify as the narcissistic personality traits. Those would be the various little balls there, the different ideas or the different connections that in the narcissistic personality. The P, the green, would be the psychopathic structures, and they connect into some of the narcissistic structures, but they're different. They're a different type of damaged in the networks. And then we have with the terrorist mind, a prominent feature is sadism, and that's opening up sadism and understanding that is what's needed to open up the terrorist mind in our broader sense. In the family courts, it's present, but it's quieter in the family courts, the sadism line. Sometimes it gets pretty flamboyant, and those are really dangerous situations. But and then the different radicals, they're called, those orange balls, those are sort of added additions onto the core structure that give the pathology its characteristic features. So the core structure is in the terrorist mind in Israel and Gaza, in Maine, in Las Vegas shooter, Pulse nightclub, Uvalde. All of that core structure is the same, but the differences in all those different ones goes into a school and shoots kids. The other, attacks Israel and kills civilians in Israel. The other, just shoots up a nightclub or, just attacks innocents in other situations. And those are the variants are caused by those orange attachment things, the radicals. They give the different flavor to the pathology's manifestation. And so the there's a consistent set of symptoms that this pathology produces, and the features of it are the symptoms are in the zone of the anger dysregulation. There's a hatred and there's a violence. And so that shares the commonality across all the different variants of the pathology: anger, hatred, violence. And in the family courts, the violence is symbolic. And it's the psychological or symbolic killing of the child's killing of the other parent's child as a retaliation for the failed divorce, or the failed marriage and divorce. And so that in the family courts, it's a symbolic violence, but it can move up, and I'll talk about that in a little while. It can move up into an actual violent kind of situation. So, um, the core feature of the pathology, as because we don't have a focused attention right now to the actual pathology, the pathological hatred and pathological violence. The domain of pathology we're talking about would be organized into the personality pathologies, and specifically into the dark personalities, uh, dark triad, vulnerable dark triad, and dark tetrad. The vulnerable dark triad is more prevalent in the family courts, not as much in the social surround of the terrorist mind. And so in talking about the terrorist mind, I'll be focused more on the narcissistic, psychopathic, dark triad, dark tetrad zone of personality pathology. And Gianmarco and Vernon define or describe what the dark triad is. So, first cited by Paul Hoos and Williams, the dark triad refers to a set of three distinct but related antisocial personality traits: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Each of the dark triads traits is associated with feelings of superiority and privilege. This, coupled with a lack of remorse and empathy, often leads individuals high in these socially malevolent traits to exploit others for their own personal gain. And and so that is the core of the pathology, the dark triad. The Machiavellian manipulation was stronger in the family courts than in the social surround of the main shooter is not necessarily demonstrating the manipulative aspects of the line. It's more the narcissistic psychopathy, the malevolent traits, and the sadistic line. So sadism is higher in the social surround, Machiavellianism is less. In the family courts, Machiavellian manipulation is higher, and the sadism tends to be a little bit less. We have more of the dark triad and vulnerable dark triad. The so so the research literature has identified, and this is out of the research, the dark personalities are not diagnostic. They've been identified in the research literature as a constellation of personality characteristics as opposed to a single personality disorder. It's a grouping. And the reason it groups is because it has these core structures to it. It's not random. And so, why do we see this grouping of symptoms? There's attachment, there's connections between the various idea structures, the various meaning structures of the pathology. There's a reason for it. But in the research literature, these personalities have been identified as the core of evil. Now, I was blown away when I looking through the research literature on personality pathology, and I hear them talking about that they've kind of located where evil is, and it's here. It's in the dark personalities. So we have Book and colleagues here talking about unpacking evil, claiming the core of the dark triad. And then later they talk about unpacking more evil, which is the core of the dark tetrad. Uh, the dark personalities in the family courts. Uh, Melanie Greenham has, there we go. Melanie Greenham has written a series of articles along with me on the dark personalities in the family courts. And the first article here talks about um, the dark personalities in the family courts and how to solve it. Second article talks about the research gap in the family courts, and that is substantial. We have research in attachment, ADHD, everything else has research in it. There's no research in the family courts. Where are the grants coming out of the Department of Justice? Where are the grants coming out of just people? Just you know, money institutions, Bill Gates and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or whoever. Where are the grants coming into the family courts to study the pathology over here in the high conflict divorce? There are none. And part of the reason for that is because everybody's been making stuff up. So we have no operational definitions for what's in the family courts because everybody fights about it. So we need to apply established knowledge. That's what I did. And in Foundations, my book Foundations, I did provide an operational definition for the pathology in the three diagnostic indicators of attachment based parental alienation, which I describe in Foundations and describe elsewhere. It's on a checklist and various things. And that not only will identify the pathology clinically, if you have the clinical people check the three diagnostic indicators, 12 associated clinical signs as support, we will be able to identify the pathology in the family courts for clinical purposes, and we can also identify it for research purposes, which is what the third article did when Melanie worked with Dorsey Pruder's data set. And so Dorsey Pruder is filling in the gap. She's a businesswoman and family coach, and she saw the research gap that's over here. So she created a business model where she collects the data surrounding all these families and brings in data taggers or data coders. It's a type of research methodology called content analysis. And she works up the data and looks at where the data says on the three diagnostic indicators, 12 associated clinical signs. And so Melanie got MOU for that and to get access, memorandum of understanding to get access to Dorsey's data and worked it up. And that's the third article looking at the 12 associated clinical signs that I propose will often be present. And so there's a set of three articles up on ResearchGate regarding the dark personalities in the family courts. The structure of the terrorist mind is in three basic domains: the domains of damage. The first set of symptoms that are characteristic of this pathology is an absence of empathy. And now, the absence of empathy is a capacity for cruelty. And I'll cite over to Baron Cohen and his work on the absence. He kind of traced out the science around the absence of empathy and how it leads to evil, leads to cruelty. And so that's the first component. That there will be an immense cruelty to all of the symptom displays for this pathology. The second is a deviant social morality. Now, the terrorist mind may have a flamboyant morality. You see that a lot of times in the religious variants where they very rigid morality sometimes, but it's deviant from the rest of us. It allows them to do these acts that it's not part of our shared sort of social morality, which is what's so shocking to us in this situation. And then the sadism, and it's the sadism that is a critical feature of the terrorist mind. Um, And so, as the mental health people, as the psychologists begin to get in here and look at that, it's going to be unlocking how the sadism works and how it functions within the system that's going to allow us to deactivate the terrorist mind. So, to understand sadism, I looked into it. That early on, do my research. So I looked into what we know about sadism, and I know enough about it. I've gone deep enough into it that I got what I need to know. It's not a place. It's not a pleasant pathology to understand. So sadism is a gratification of a need. And it's a gratific, and that word is important. Gratification. So it's like a hunger, a need, a desire. It's a and there's a motivational drive, and it gets gratified. And the important thing to understand with this is that the sadism feels good. Okay, they like to cause suffering. Our suffering satisfies that desire, that hunger, and it feels good when we suffer. Part of that is related to empathy networks, that when they create the suffering in us, it binds us to them and their suffering. Otherwise, they are immensely alone in this tremendous suffering that's caused by the core of sadism, the shame line. And so they're to escape their isolation, psychological isolation, social isolation, that they cause the suffering in others, and then they feel connected, and it gratifies and it brings them back into the human community in a perverse kind of way. But they belong again because you now understand how I feel, my suffering. So that you can see that prominently in the Israel Gaza Hamas attack, that you now feel how I suffer. Israel now feels how the Palestinians suffer, but holy cow, yeah, it's going back the other way as well, and it's deeply disturbing. So understanding the sadism and understanding it's a gratification. It feels good to cause suffering. And so that's the idea that we call it terrorist because we're afraid and it's creating terror in us. That's not the point of it. It's not to create fear. It's a little bit on the domination. So if you go back to the little balls, there's a domination uh, set of information structures, and the fear that's caused by the pathology satisfies or that domination kind of aspect. But for the most part, the motivation is causing suffering in others. And so you can see that across Maine to the Pulse nightclub to Parkland or Uvalde school shootings, to Ukraine or uh, Israel, Gaza. The idea of causing suffering in others is at the core of the pathology. The different variants, and that's how I kind of look at it. I see the core structure, and then I see a set of variants based on how the individual radicals around it are aligned. And those depend on what the trauma was that caused it and the context that's eliciting the pathology. So those two aspects, the cause and the content, will determine the variant, the various features of the variants. Um, and so again, looking at the structure here, it's a caffeine molecule, but what we could do is go back into each one of those little ball things, define what those idea structures, those meaning structures are, and how they're interconnected. And it's three-dimensional, so it'll go up and down as well, and define the structures, and then we can add the various radicals around that for the different variants. But this is an example using a caffeine molecule. And so, for example, the justification would be the different variant justifications that would be used, whether it's war or a personal grievance or a racist idea of purity or the righteous warrior of a religious terrorist or something. All those different justifications would be coming off of one particular radical. And so it's not part of the core structure, it's just whatever that particular domain is, that information structure is going to then shoot it into its particular variant. Now, the pathology has a death line to it. It's obvious in Maine and it's obvious in Israel and Gaza and everywhere. It's not as obvious in the family courts because in the family courts, it's that symbolic um, violence, it's a symbolic death. They're killing the child of the other parent in retaliation for the failed marriage and divorce. That's brutal spousal abuse. That's the most brutal and vicious spousal abuse I can imagine. The targeted parent used to have a child, but after the divorce, they don't have a child anymore. The other parent has psychologically killed the child. So that's the death line in the family courts. Occasionally, it will flare into the open. Sometimes with a borderline mom, she'll kill herself and the child, and rarely the dad because she wants the dad to suffer, but she'll kill herself and the child to prevent the separation. Sometimes you'll see that with the borderline. More often of concern is the narcissistic dad on this. And that's the Caden's law is concerned with that variant, the narcissistic dad who kills ex-wife kills the child, then kills himself. Kids can't leave the child if everybody's leaving, so he takes his family with him to the stuff, and so occasionally will flare into active. And with spousal abuse pathology, which is what this is, the most dangerous time for the abused wife, typically wife, is when she makes that escape. So when she gets the kids and gets them into that domestic violence shelter, it's that transition that is the highest risk period. And for in the family courts, it's when that protective separation is initiated. So all mental health professionals need to be aware that this has an active death line, and we need to make sure that it doesn't get triggered when we get the protective separation. Not all the time, not all the time. A lot of most often it's just a symbolic situation. It doesn't trigger, but we need to be aware that this pathogen has one. And as I kind of look at it, I see it as the death line in three parts. One is primarily suicide, and then the homicide is secondary. So that would be like your main shooter. He was going to suicide, and he wrote a little note and stuff. And now the homicides were secondary to that. That was the display, but that ultimately is going to move into the suicide self-destruction. Then there's the homicide one, which is like the Hamas variant, where they're out to kill, and that's the motivational purpose. But then the suicide becomes part of secondary feature of that they die in that homicide movement. So they kind of spin on each other, and they're both are present. But I would, based on the radicals around, the motivation is either going to be more to kill or more to suicide self-destruct, and the killing is part of that. um, in the family courts, if a narcissist moves into the death line, into active, they're going to be the homicide. So the narcissistic dad is going to want to kill the ex-wife, and then he's going to have to kill himself, and he's going to have to kill the child because there's no parents around, and he takes his whole family with him. The borderline is going to be more on the suicide line, where she's going to kill herself, but she's can't separate from the child. She'll take her child, but she doesn't mess with the dad because he gets to suffer. Oh, how you didn't take care of me! Aren't you sad and sorry now? Um, and so that's the death line associated with this. The and then the individual and group. For example, this is just an example. if we have one of the radicals up there on the top, coming off the sadism for the individual, if we have the proper information structures there, then we're going to have the individual acting alone, the lone wolf shooter kind of stuff. If we have a different radical in a different place on the sadism line, we get the group, we get the people working together towards a purpose, the terrorist groups or the militias, or various people who glom on to each other for a similar purpose. And so that would be kind of how I see the different variants working with this. The justifications, there are primarily, in my mind, primarily four that I've noted. First is there's the righteous warrior of morality. That's often your religious variant. But you get this righteous warrior kind of stuff. It doesn't necessarily need to be religious. It's just that mindset that the person's an avenging angel for some sort of righteous cause. Um, Abortion could do that with some of the radical abortion, blowing up abortion clinics or something. That's the righteous cause, the righteous warrior of morality. The second variant would be a political or war. That's the just cause. We have a just cause to validate our pathological violence. And I put the word war in quote because we need to start challenging that concept as being in any way a normal range brain state. No, it's not. That's deeply pathological. And that's once we understand that, we can then begin to look at the pathology and not make excuses for it under certain circumstances. When it's our just cause, it's not pathological. Yes, it is. The and that's being brought into the open right now in Gaza because Israel has a just cause. Absolutely, they were violated and caused great suffering by the attacks. And so everybody kind of recognizes that they have a right to defend themselves and so they do have a just cause. But then you look at what's happening in Gaza, and the civilians in Gaza didn't do that. That was other people and the destruction. So it's pathological. There's no normal range to this. And hopefully in 3 or 5 generations, we'll be able to evolve out of this mindset of war. The other type is a personal grievance. And that's the empathy for suffering. They suffer and they're going to create suffering in others so that we get empathy and they feel connected back into the community. So it's not necessarily the empathy directly, it's that isolation that's caused by the lack of connection, the lack of empathy that they have. And that's very painful. Isolation and loneliness and they're just alienation, psychological alienation from yourself, from the rest of the world. And so they rebond by creating that suffering in others. And they'll spend a lot of time, all of these will, but the personal grievance will spend a lot of time kind of building to the act and nurturing the grieving and the suffering that will be caused as a way of satisfying that drive state, that need, sadistic kind of quality. And then you have the racist, anti-Semitic of various qualities, depending on the context and the culture and things. But that has an undercurrent of purity. You'll hear that, racial purity or, whatever. There's a purity line to it that's coming off of shame. So it's a shame-based feature with this one. The shame line is there for all of them, but it's going to be particularly pronounced in the racist, anti-Semitic line. Righteous warrior of morality also carries a strong activation on the shame line. So just as an example to look at the various classifications that I would give to the situations, I would put the Hamas attack. That's a group variant. It has homicidal primacy and it's with the war justification. Maine, that would be an individual variant. It has a suicidal primacy, and it's a grievance um, variant. The Buffalo shooting was an individual. It's homicidal as its primary focus, and it has a racist motivation. In the family courts, we have group, interesting, group symbolic on the motivate on the variant, and then it's a personal grievance. Now, as I was considering, how would I define the group, the family courts? Is it an individual? Is it the um, targeted, the allied parents pathology that's driving this as an individual variant? And no, because we have all sorts of flying monkeys that get attached to it, including the mental health people, including the courts, including just stray people that glom on and support the pathology. If the mental health people were to not support it, if they were to actually diagnose and treat it and identify it, then it wouldn't be existent in the family courts because we'd be identifying it. So the only reason this pathology can exist in the family courts is because it has collusive participants who support it. So I would define the family court pathology right now as a group. Once we um, solve the pathology, once we recognize what's in the family court, shared delusion, factitious disorder, and the mental health people start solving it and diagnosing it and treating it, then I would shift categories over to the individual because it's in the individual mind. But currently, it captures a lot of people. So the the Las Vegas shooter, 9/11, Parkland, Maine, Hamas, Birmingham church bombing, Paris shooting, Boston marathon bombing, the Islamic State, the Pulse nightclub. I will assert that all of those are variants of the same core pathological structures of a damaged mind. Those are not the product of a normal range spectrum, and they all carry the same characteristics. The absence of empathy, capacity for cruelty or damaged empathy, the deviant social morality that's not part of our shared idea of right and wrong. That gives it its evil component. When you think something is evil, that's that second one, the absence of shared morality, and then the sadism, the desire to cause suffering, and so that's very characteristic of the pathology. The by the way, in the family courts, the the Caden's law is concerned about the narcissistic dark triad dad, who's actually presents a threat to the child and the ex-wife, the mother, and that's legitimate. That pathology's there, and the women tend to bring that up as a domestic violence issue to highlight the threat of the person because he may not be necessarily directly abusive. It's been more directed towards the spouse. And so she presents the spousal abuse as the risk factor that then encompasses the child. And so that's what you hear from the Caden's Law group. Sometimes I call them DV monkeys because they're so into the any allegation of domestic violence should be believed, and that's not true. What we need to do is move the idea of domestic violence over to the actual clinical terminology, which is intimate partner violence, IPV, because the research indicates there's two types of intimate partner violence. The first type is situational. That's where people, the couple, things got out of hand. They got an argument, things get out of hand, you get a little pushing, something. Not good, not good. But if we can get the people separated, neither one is a danger relative. It's just you put the two together and things got out of hand. That's called situational intimate partner violence. The one we're concerned about, the second category, is called terrorist intimate partner violence. They call it terrorist because it's the terrorist mind. It's that pathological mind of pathological hatred, pathological anger, pathological violence. And that's the one we're concerned about. So when Caden's Law, the domestic violence rights or protection people come forward on their assertions. I agree with their assertions, but it's not blanket. It's not just any allegation should be considered, because then you have the borderline mothers who are making false allegations, shared persecutory delusion. And so we need to do a proper assessment of the intimate partner violence issues when those are raised, but of the child abuse issues is what we're focused on in the family courts. So the damaged information networks in the brain. So if we go back to our little structure, where is the damage and what it's involved with? Based on the symptoms, there's going to be damaged in three areas. The first is damaged in the love and bonding system, in the attachment networks. That's where all the damage, when they were damaged by trauma. So you damage the attachment networks and you leave an imprint of what the trauma was to them. And so it's a particular type of childhood trauma. Primarily in the intergenerational transmission, it's going to be sex abuse entered somewhere in the family, and it's a sex abuse that creates the sadism. If you just get physical violence in your child abuse, you're more likely to get the narcissistic and even maybe even the psychopathic. But the sadism comes off of the sex abuse, and it doesn't have to be that parent. It can go a generation, even two generations. It enters the family system, and then it starts affecting relationships, primarily affecting parenting. And so we see it rippling through generations through the distorted parenting that the damage creates. And so the damage was created by trauma. It carries the imprint of the trauma. And then the variant to the pathology is created by the specifics of the trauma that was exposed, and then the current context that will elicit the variance. So if the context is not present that supports the manifestation, then the pathology won't trigger. So for many families in the family courts, there was the minimal kinds of problems during the marriage. It didn't flame or become as flamboyant during the marriage, but obviously it was bad because it wound up leading to a divorce. But it was when the divorce happened, now you have this context that particularly activates the pathology into its flamboyant manifestations. So the damage information structures create a consistent set of symptoms: absence of empathy, deviant social morality, and sadism. The damage information structures. Let's talk about those for a second. So you can think of them like ideas. I call them meme structures off of Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene and what he put forward, because it's more specific, and I can work better at understanding specifically what information structures are then linking to other information structures, which are then linking to other information. And so there's a reason that the narcissist displays with a pattern of diagnostic symptoms. There's a reason why the psychopath does that. There's a reason for sadism, and there's a reason they're all constellated together in Machiavellian manipulation, that the information structures link to each other. And the most fine-grained description of that is by using this idea of memes. Now, memes come from Richard Dawkins and the Selfish Gene, Chapter 11. And you can Google this, Chapter 11. If you Google Richard Dawkins, Chapter 11 memes, you'll get a PDF. Various people have PDFs up of that particular chapter where he talks about it. And the Selfish Gene is a great book. You don't necessarily need to read that for this pathology other than Chapter 11. But what he says basically is we evolve based on selectivity of our genes. But then he makes a proposal. Not necessarily. We may be evolving based on our memes, the function that the system serves. And so evolution may be driven by memes, not genes. And so that's his idea they put forward. Um, but then also, I want to just point out the Lucifer principle, a scientific exploration into the forces of history by Bloom. He takes Richard Dawkins' ideas of the meme and applies it to the terrorist mind, specifically more on the religious terrorist mind. And there's a particular meme that gets in there that is particularly predatory, that it will tolerate no other ideas structure, challenging idea structure in the brain. And so it will go out and kill other people in order to eradicate that idea from the thing. And you'll see that in all these extremist places where he points it out as things like the Islamic State or something, the religious fanaticism that will kill you if you disagree, the morality police going around and killing you if you disagree. But it's not necessarily to that religion. The Christianity had that during the Crusades. If you don't, believe Christianity, we're going to kill you. And the Catholics were killing the Protestants and stuff. And so that idea that we have a particularly predatory meme that's in there, he puts that forward. And the solution then for a predatory meme would be you have to extract it. It's like surgically removing this disease process. Uh, yeah, that could well be true. For when you run into this particularly predatory meme structure that will kill other people if they have a different idea, um, the potentially the only way is to remove that mind from our social surround, either through prison or execution somehow. So the damaged information structures are the empathy networks, the social morality networks, and the sadism networks. And each one of those would have more involved with it. But I want to point out specifically the sadism networks, that there's going to be a shame line under those. And that's going to be prominent. And you may not see it at first. You may see it on the flip side, where that's where you get the purity thing, and the proud boys. You get to see the upside of how they're presenting, but beneath the surface there's a shame line that's moving. That gets into the degradation of your victim and suffering, and it's a lot of the sadism stuff. And then there's the self-destruction line, the death line that comes off the sadism. And it's a self-destruction line, and the self-destruction moves into death more broadly. But at the core, the pathology wants to heal itself. It wants to be exposed. It wants us to see it, but it can't expose itself, and because it's too dangerous for it, that mindset. And so it wants us to come in and see it. That's the empathy that would be part of the cure. And it will self-destruct in that process, and but take a lot of people with it when it does, because it wants to be seen. So the pathogen in the family courts, let's talk about that for a second. We have narcissistic borderline and dark personalities. They are undiagnosed and untreated in the family courts. They are here, and they are wreaking havoc with the families and the children. And mental health really needs to get in here and start diagnosing it so that the court can start protecting both the child but also the parents from this extremely malevolent pathology. And right now, nothing. There's no protection for any of the children. And we know this pathology is present. Estimates around 10% of people have narcissistic borderline spectrum kinds of issues. And wouldn't you know, 10% of divorces turn out to be high conflict custody cases. And the personality pathology is high conflict. So the death line in the family courts, again, to highlight that, is expressed by the symbolic killing of the other parent's child in retaliation for the failed marriage and divorce. And the theme you will hear is that the targeted parent deserves to suffer. That's the theme. And that's associated clinical sign 11 on the diagnostic checklist, that the parent deserves to be rejected. And in Dorsey Pruder's data, in the third article from Melanie Greenham, myself, and Miss Pruder, um, the that symptom feature, that the targeted parent deserves to be rejected, was found in all 46 families who had the three diagnostic indicators. All 46 families had the three diagnostic indicators, which indicates that my model for describing the pathology is accurate, because holy cow, I made a prediction that's going to be present, and they were 46 all present. But the associated clinical sign 11 was prevalent in all 46 families 100% of the time. So again, that shows the model that I'm proposing is accurate. Some of the other features associated with once we have a dark personality, virtuous victim signaling, that the um, they present as a virtuous victim to get resources. So again, Melanie's article talks a lot about this, but Oak talk about the virtuous victimhood and the dark triad. It's particularly characteristic. Narcissists don't like to present as victims; they like to present as grandiose, virtuous. The psychopath doesn't want to present as virtuous because they don't know how to fake that. They present as a victim. The manipulative, though, of the dark triad will present as both the virtuous victim to get people on board. And the other associated feature is judicial manipulation, the dark triad, and the detection of parental judicial manipulators. And so, yeah, dark triad is in the family courts, and we know that. We need to be taking steps to address what we know is in the family courts. So, high conflict communication as well, from Horan, Gwynn, and Banghart. Results indicated that individuals reporting higher levels of dark triad personality structure also reported more frequent disagreement that was also intense and hostile. We have high conflict divorce. That's, yeah, we got a dark personality, dark triad creating it. Moreover, dark triad personality reports were directly related to the use of contempt, criticism, stonewalling, and defensiveness, messages collectively known as the four horsemen, as they predict relational termination. And so we know these people. It's in the research, but we're not applying any of that knowledge in the family courts. These are high conflict people. We should anticipate they're coming in. We should anticipate. So we don't want to diagnose the parent. We don't need to. We can diagnose the child's symptoms. We don't need to get a diagnosis on the parent. But we do want to understand what's here. We have narcissistic, borderline, psychopathic, dark, manipulative, and we can see the features and then take the proper steps for child protection. And so we stay focused on the child's symptoms and protect the children from the parent. So the to wrap up here today, one of the features that I recognize is that because it's the same pathology in the family courts and in our social surround, that the family courts have a concentrated and accessible source for dark personalities available for research. So again, Melanie's my second article on the research gap over here. We have the dark personalities in right here, and they're in the family courts. We know where they are, and they're self-identifying through the high conflict. And so we can actually bring research in and understand the nature of the pathology and its solution. And so we can be identifying what all those little balls are on the interconnection structure, and then how to deactivate them and how to address them. And so the knowledge and solutions developed in the family court can then be applied to all the pathogens variants. Now, the family court interventions will need to be individual and focused. We're looking at child abuse and the child abuse. So we're going to come in and look at individual situations and how do we address them. But what we learn about the pathogen that's causing the pathology everywhere can then be applied in interventions that are more broadly distributed, meme structures, idea structures that we distribute within our shared mind space that will deactivate select idea structures, meme structures in the pathological brain. Once we understand what they are, and we say we want to deactivate this one, we want to deactivate or move this one, or do this with this, we can then target certain idea structures or meme structures to do that. I've been doing that a lot with the forensic psychologists and professional psychology and stuff, not so much with the pathogen directly, to a degree, but not so much, mostly with just the pathogen's expression in the forensic psychologist minds and stuff. And so um, the what we need to start with is get the research over in the family courts. And the first step to research with the pathology in the family courts is to operationally define the pathology for the purposes of the research. How do we know when it's present or not? We can't do that with parental alienation because there's no such thing. And so everybody just fights about that. So we have no operational definition for even identifying what the pathology is in the family courts. And so there can be no research on it other than like retrospective stuff that's kind of all made up. But once we identify the pathology, and that's what, again, Brigham Childress did, and 46 families have the 3 diagnostic indicators, that provides an operational definition that will then allow the researchers to identify which families are in that category of pathology, and then we can begin to look at all the various associations with that. So it's the same pathogen, cause of pathology. It's the same pathogen causing the pathological hatred and pathological violence in our society and in the family courts. It's narcissistic, psychopathic, sadistic, and it's the dark personalities. And it is the core of evil. We have it out there. We see it being manifested out there. And it's in the family courts, and it's not being addressed in the family courts. And that's devastating. We need to do that. And if we solve the pathology in the family courts, and we can then leverage the knowledge to solve the pathology in our social surround. So if we solve it here, we can solve it there, because it's the same pathogen, and we have a concentrated dose in the family courts. So that's the connection I would like to make, and that's where I tell parents sometimes that you're part of something larger, and don't realize it because you're focused on your kids. Naturally, they're your kids. You're the most precious thing to you in the world, and you're trying to protect them from this evil pathology that's destroying their lives. And so I totally get why you're focused on your individual situation. As from the more elevated perspective of my role, I can see where over the course of time, when we solve the pathology in the family courts, we will then have the necessary information to solve it more broadly, the pathogen that lives in our brains, the damaged information structures in the attachment networks. So with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday here. Good luck to everybody in the family courts, and good luck to the people in Ukraine and Gaza and Israel and in Maine and the next location where this pathogen will erupt. So with that, take care, everybody.